Hello everybody, my name is Kara, and today I'm here with my April wrap-up. As I have been doing recently, this will be filmed in two parts but uploaded together, so let's get into the books. The first book I finished was The Host by Stephanie Meyer. This was a buddy read with my friend Kelly from Cozy Reader Kelly. This was a reread for her, but this was the first time I had ever read it, even though I have really enjoyed the movie for a long time. And in this world there has been an alien invasion of Earth. There are these creatures called souls, and essentially it's like a for your own good kind of invasion where they take over the hosts, in this case the humans on Earth, and they stop all conflict. Nobody ever fights, there's no murder, no sickness, no war, things like that. But of course the humans do not have their own minds anymore. They're completely controlled by these souls. And our main character is a soul named Wanderer, and at the beginning of the book she gets placed into her host body, who was a girl named Melanie, and Melanie is fighting back, so Wanderer can't really take full control of her, and she starts getting these pieces of memory or emotion from Melanie about her brother and about other people she cares about, and those start affecting Wanderer as well. And Wanderer and Melanie sort of end up having to become allies in the same body, even though they're kind of fighting over the same body, in order to find a safe haven that Melanie knew about, where there seems to be a group of humans that have managed to stay hidden from the souls, and so they're free. So the rest of the book is about Wanderer's experiences with humanity, and kind of realizing her own humanity and kind of like discovering emotion and friendships and relationships for the first time. And this was interesting. I liked it overall. I definitely think that Stephanie Meyer's writing improved. I'm not a big fan of the Twilight series, and I think that this was substantially better in my opinion. I really loved the friendship between Melanie and Wanderer. Their bond was really lovely, and I liked seeing that explored. There's also a love triangle kind of in this book, but I actually really liked it because it was very complicated, and I liked the sci-fi way that was explored, because it was essentially a love triangle involving 4 different people but in 3 bodies, because Melanie and Wanderer kind of start getting their feelings mixed up about these 2 guys that they both know. And I actually really enjoyed the romance subplot involving Wanderer. I won't talk about who that is because you don't actually, that doesn't actually happen until later in the book, but I liked it. I liked how caring and respectful he was, and how he always gave Wanderer space. The relationship in this book was definitely a lot healthier than the ones in Twilight, at least in my opinion. And I also liked this kind of take on the alien invasion. I know that this is not the first book to have like a for your own good kind of invasion, but I like the way that was explored here. As for things I didn't like, I do think this book was much longer than it needed to be, especially the beginning. I also really didn't like Jared's character, and I wish there had been less of him in the book. I understand why he was important, but I just didn't want to ever spend time with him. And also there were a few things that I really didn't like about the Twilight books that I feel like kind of carried over into this one. But for the most part, I didn't mind them as much because they made more narrative sense here. So the ones I can think of off the top of my head, like having a self-sacrificing female main character to the point of it being kind of ridiculous. And I'm also like, I don't mind having main characters who are selfless. I know a lot of people hate that. I don't actually mind it in general, but I remember in the Twilight books, it kind of got to the point where like any little thing would go wrong with the vampires and Bella would be like, I know, what if I kill myself? And it was just like a lot. And that still kind of happened in this book, but I think it made more sense because Wanderer's species was just kind of like that. And also there were some kind of weird ideas about body ownership in this book, or like who like owns the girl characters and everything. But again, considering the fact that they are actually host bodies for another creature, I think it made more sense. So like even the stuff where I'm like, this is a little weird, it bothered me a lot less in this book. So overall I had a fun time with this, and I'm glad I finally read it. Next I read The Tea Dragon Festival by Katie O'Neill. This is the sequel to The Tea Dragon Society, and I loved this even more than the first volume. Thank you so much, Katie, for gifting this to me. As with the first volume, I just adored the art style so much. The color palette and the illustrations and everything are just stunningly beautiful. I loved them. I liked that there was more plot in this one. This is also a beautifully diverse series. We also have, I think, sign language in this book, which is really cool. My only complaint is what I said about the first volume, and that's I want more of the actual tea dragons. Like we did spend some time with them, and we did spend some time with other creatures that I really enjoyed, but like the thing that I love about this series is the tea dragons, and I want to see more of them. But that said, this was still absolutely delightful and pretty much perfect, and I gave the Tea Dragon Festival 5 stars. Next, I finished Angel and Bavar by Amy Wilson. This is a middle grade Beauty and the Beast retelling, and we follow 2 main characters, Angel and Bavar, so this is dual perspective. And Angel is a girl who, her parents were killed in a horrible accident or incident, I think several months ago at this point, and she believes that there's something strange about that other people around her aren't really acknowledging. Like, she doesn't think it was exactly natural what happened to them. And then Bavar is the Beast character, and he lives in this weird old house, and he and his family have always fought monsters. They fought to keep monsters out of the human world, and they come through at the point where their house is, so they've kind of like, they're the guardians of that gate almost. And Bavar doesn't want to turn into what his parents did, because if you fight the monsters for too long, or if you kind of let yourself get too invested in it almost. You kind of become a monster yourself, and Bavar saw that happen with his parents, and he doesn't want that to happen to him, so he's been trying not to fight back. And so this book is about Angel and Bavar's journey and getting to know each other and becoming friends. Angel ends up kind of helping Bavar, possibly, with the fighting back that he is supposed to be doing. I really liked Bavar as a main character. He's this very, like, he looks so scary, but he's this real, like, gentle giant kind of character, and I just found him very endearing, and I just wanted good things for him. And I really enjoyed his family as well, especially his grandfather. I did not anticipate him being one of my favorite characters, but he kind of was. And just the family relationships in general, like Angel's foster parents, I really enjoyed them, and seeing their slowly developing relationship with Angel, because Angel's very broken, understandably, by what has happened to her, so it takes a while, but I really ended up enjoying where that went. And I also really liked the ending. There's actually a particular scene at the end that bumped this up from a 3 to a 3.5 stars, because I just think it was so well done. But as for the things I didn't like, Angel as a protagonist I found much less engaging than Bavar. Not that she was necessarily poorly written or even like her character didn't make sense, because it did, but I'm just realizing that there are certain character archetypes where you can have a very good reason for being the way that you are, and I just don't find you as interesting to read about most of the time. And that's kind of how I felt with Angel. Like, she was so angry and she wanted to fight everything all the time, and I get that, like, the things that she went through are horrifying, and I understand why she responded the way she did, but it kind of made all of her actions and choices and interactions with other people feel kind of the same. And then I also felt the plot was a little bit lacking. I just kind of wanted, I either wanted more things to happen in this book, or I wanted the characters to be more, I guess, proactive about pursuing the things that happened in the plot. I know that's very vague. So like I said, I gave Angel and Bavar 3.5 stars. I still would definitely recommend it if it sounds like something you're interested in. Next, I finished the Mystwick School of Musicraft by Jessica Corey. So I didn't actually realize when I started this that this was urban fantasy. This world is essentially our world, like modern day, except that there's this thing called Musicraft, which is magic that comes from playing music, and it has to be live music. We follow our main character Amelia, and she wants to go to the Mystwick School of Musicraft, which is one of the most prestigious schools for learning Musicraft. She wants to do this partly because she's passionate about it, but a large part of that is because her mother, who actually died many years ago, she lives with her grandmother. Amelia's mother was a very skilled practitioner of Musicraft, and so Amelia wants to feel close to her. So she has an audition, and unfortunately she totally bombs it. But then something happens where she kind of gets a second chance, and so she does end up going to the School of Musicraft, and the rest of the book is about her trying to figure out what music really means to her, also kind of trying to understand what her purpose is at this school, like what her place is, and trying to prove that she belongs there. And there are also some mysteries that kind of crop up in this book about her roommate Darby, who is this other girl on the cover, and about some strange, mysterious things that might be happening at Mystwick. And I really enjoyed this. I absolutely loved the world and this portrayal of music as magic. I'm kind of picky with seeing music portrayed in books, but I think this book did it in a really enjoyable and really thoughtful way. I think one of my favorite things about this book was just seeing all the tiny details about the way that our world would be different if Musicraft was a thing. Like seeing newspaper headlines about like orchestras playing a new piece that they think is going to help like develop a cure for cancer, things like that. It's just so fascinating to see how our world's problems would be affected by having this very unusual kind of solution, but also how it wouldn't fix everything. Like, there are still wars, there's still conflict, there are still natural disasters, and now just Musicraft is a way to try and combat those. I also ended up really liking a lot of the characters. It's funny because in this book there's a couple of things that I tend to really not like that I think were done really well, and one of them is Amelia and her roommate Darby's relationship. In general, I really don't like the trope of a girl's roommate who just like takes an instant hate to her, and then we have like so many pages of them like hating each other, sabotaging each other, fighting, all of this. But in this book, I understood why. Like, it really didn't bother me because the reason Darby blamed Amelia, like, it was definitely unfair. Like, she was blaming her for something that wasn't her fault, but her reaction was also very human. Like, I think a lot of people would have responded to this situation by being angry at Amelia, even though it wasn't actually her fault. And then another thing I tend not to like is when part of the conflict of a book is solved by like just believing in yourself. And like, especially with fantasy, when the magic is so dependent on willpower that one of the big climactic moments happens when the main character like realizes that they had this power all along, or they finally understand how to use their power or something. Even though, like, I know that moments of realization happen in real life, but in a fantasy setting that can kind of be irritating for me. But in this book it didn't bother me because music and performance and that kind of thing, that is a very belief heavy skill set. Like the way that you think about yourself and the way you see yourself and your self-confidence drastically affects your performance. So it actually made sense to me that that would make such a big difference in this book or in solving the conflict of this book. The only things I didn't like as much, there were a few little things in the plot that I wish like had been solved quicker, or like we hadn't taken quite so many detours. And also there's this one tiny thing at the very end that something about Amelia and her grandmother that was kind of resolved, but not really. And I was really disappointed that we got to the end of the book and that wasn't like fully addressed. But other than that, I really enjoyed this. Highly recommend. And I gave the Mystwick School of Musicraft 4 stars. Next, I finished Granny Torelli Makes Soup by Sharon Creech. This is a very, very short middle grade book. And I have read this before. I actually read this, I think, several times when I was younger, but I hadn't read it for many years. And it's a deceptively simple premise because our main character is a girl named Rosie, and her grandmother Torelli comes over to her house and helps her make soup. And while they do that, they talk. They talk about their family, they talk about their friends, they talk about some problems that Rosie has been having with her friends. And this is just like an absolutely lovely book, and it's really hard for me to explain it in a way that does it justice. Because again, it sounds like such a non-story almost, but there is so much depth here. I really love the writing of this. It kind of like the premise, it's deceptively simple in that it's not overly poetic. Like it doesn't have a lot of lovely language or anything. But it's so specific. Like the way things are written, it's like you can hear the characters' accents and their voices in your head. Like Rosie, you know exactly the kind of little girl voice she has because of the way her dialogue is written. And her grandmother Torelli, you can picture this Italian grandma with her certain accent and like her certain mannerisms and everything. Like the word choice is just so good for this book. And I also love the characters. Like again, this is so short, but you really, really get a feeling for who these people are and how much they care about each other. Like Granny Torelli and Rosie, their relationship is just absolutely heartwarming and beautiful, and especially when you find out more about Granny Torelli's like history, you really understand how much this relationship means to her and to Rosie too. There's also a lot of really wonderful themes that are covered in this, things like grief and loss and friendship fights, and also learning disabilities or disabilities in general. Like Rosie's best friend Bailey, he's I think partially blind, or he has some vision impairment, and you really get a feeling for how that changes his life and how that changes Bailey and Rosie's friendship. Rosie has a very good heart, but she's very young and she doesn't really understand why some of the things that she's trying to do to help Bailey would actually kind of offend him or hurt him. So seeing them work through that was just really lovely, and I can't say enough wonderful things about this book. This is one where I remember liking it as a kid, but reading it as an adult, it just hits so much harder. Like there are many scenes where I'm sure as a kid I understood them. Like I knew why something was sad or beautiful or, you know, meaningful in some way. But reading it now as an adult with more life experience is like, oh, this really hit home. So I gave Granny Torelli Makes Soup 4.5 stars, but the more I think about it, the more I'm like, maybe this is a 5 because I can't really think of anything I would change about it. Next, I finished Otherworldly, Words Both Strange and Lovely from Around the World by Yi Lum Mak and illustrated by Kelsey Garrity Riley. And this is a very, very short illustrated nonfiction book that is basically what it sounds like, strange and lovely and interesting words from all different languages and from all over the world. So over the years, the author had kind of collected these and ended up putting them together in this book. The illustration style is just so calming and lovely. I'll see if I can insert a few pictures of it, but I really enjoyed that. And I also really liked how the words were kind of grouped together. So there would be this really pretty illustrated scene and it would all be on kind of the same theme. All of the words that the author had chosen would be on that same theme, and just seeing some of the really specific and interesting word definitions was so cool. I love the idea and the execution of this. The only drawback I would say for this book is that I wish there had been a little more variety in the languages that the author pulled from. Although that being said, if it's based on one person's interests or experience, like how can you really say like, oh, you should have chosen different words to put in here? But I really enjoyed this, really recommend it, and I gave it 4 stars. Next, I finished Defy the World by Claudia Gray. This is the second book in the Constellation trilogy, and I would say this is light science fiction in the sense that it's more about the characters and their relationships and like the exciting aspects of the plot versus going really in depth on the science and everything, which is just the kind of science fiction I like, so I really enjoyed this. This is a dual perspective novel, and our 2 main characters are Noemi and Abel. Abel is I guess kind of an android. He's like the most advanced android. In this world there are a lot of different kinds of droids or androids that are manufactured, but he's the only one of his kind. And then Noemi is a human character, and she's from the planet Genesis. And I think this is set a couple hundred years in the future maybe. So the humans on Earth basically destroyed their planet, and then they colonized another planet, Genesis, to be kind of their like emergency evacuation. But then the people that they had sent to Genesis to kind of start this colony, they realized like, we don't actually want the people from Earth coming over here to just like wreck our planet. Like we're doing things right here. We're being eco-friendly and everything. So now Earth and Genesis are at war. Earth wants to take the colony back and Genesis is fighting back against that. And the first book is about April and Noemi grudgingly going on an adventure together to try and accomplish something that will help protect Noemi's planet of Genesis. I can't really say too much about what this one is about because of spoilers, but I really enjoyed this. Hello, Kara from the future here, because I completely forgot to mention something really important about this book, and that is that in Defy the Worlds, there's a pandemic, which I did not know going into that, and I might not have picked up the book if I had known that, because that's just a little too topical right now. But by the time that came up in the book, I was already invested, so I just wanted to finish it. But I did want to warn you guys, if that's something that you're really not in the mood for, maybe keep that in mind. I will say though that the pandemic itself, it was important in the book, but it didn't actually get a lot of page time. Like we don't spend a lot of time being like immersed in that part of the setting or the plot or anything. It's more so important because it puts other events into motion. So if you're worried that the whole book is about like disease or a plague or anything, it's not, but there is that element in the book, so I just wanted to let you guys know that. I don't know how I forgot to mention it because I was literally thinking about it most of the time I was talking, but there you go. Okay, back to past Kara. I really enjoy our two main characters. Abel is so interesting. I love seeing him like start to learn more about human nature and the aspects of human nature that he is developing. And I just really enjoy the exploration of consciousness in this kind of sci-fi context. And Noemi I really love too. She is just so brave, and she's got this unshakable moral compass, which I love, but she's also open to having her mind changed if she comes across new information or new perspectives, and I really love that about her. The development of Abel and Noemi's relationship I really, really enjoy. Even though there's a couple tropes in this book that I am normally not a fan of, I think they were done really, really well. Like for example, one character being interested in the other much earlier, and then you're kind of waiting for the other person to catch up. There are very, very few books I feel like can pull that off, and I think this one did. And I also ended up really enjoying the side characters. There are a few that we actually met in the first book who I was not the biggest fan of. Like Victoria is one of them, where like she was fine, but I didn't really care about her much one way or the other. And in this book I actually really liked her. I did have some negatives for this book. Like this one felt a lot heavier on the antagonist or like conflict aspect, which, you know, you need conflict in a book. But I really liked in the first one how the conflict was more about those two characters and trying to accomplish a goal, whereas this one is much more about like the actual villain angle, which I don't tend to enjoy as much. I also didn't love that Abel and Noemi were split up for so much of this book, although it didn't bother me as much as it could have. I didn't love it, but I understand why it happened. So even though I didn't love this quite as much as book one, I still really enjoyed this. I think it's a really solid sequel, and I gave Defy the Worlds 4 stars. As I finished Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, this was our March book for the Austen Anonymous read-along. I will link all of that information down below. I have a whole playlist now if you want to catch up. And I definitely didn't finish this on time for our live show, but I pretty much have this book memorized, so I was okay. Margaret from The Word Nerd was our guest, so if you want to check out what me and Taylor and Margaret had to say about this book, I will link that live show down below. But I just love this. This has been the only Jane Austen book that I haven't tabbed, because I pretty much know every line or moment or character that I would want to discuss or talk about. So if that's any indication of how much I love this book and how many times I've reread it, I always pick up on new things in it every time I read it. And this is one where, like, I think the thing that people tend to think about with Pride and Prejudice is the romance. But as we talked about in our live show, that's actually not a super significant chunk of the book. So even though I love the romantic stuff, I really, really love the other things in this book as well, like the social commentary and the revolutionary idea of the female main character not getting married until she's happy or until she's in love. Like at the time this was written, that was still a pretty aspirational idea. And I just love that. Like this book, like just because it involves more interpersonal or ordinary conflicts, it doesn't mean that it wasn't revolutionary. I love the character development in this book. I think Darcy has the more obvious character arc, but I also really enjoy seeing how Lizzie has to come to terms with the fact that she is not infallible. You know, she's not always the best judge of people, even though that's something she prides herself on. This book just means so much to me, on a personal level for one thing, but I think also just as a story, I think this is a fantastic one. The characters are rich, the commentary is really layered, the humor is top-notch. I just love everything about this book, and of course I gave Pride and Prejudice 5 stars. Next, I finished The Lines We Cross by Rhonda Abdel Fattah. This is an Australian contemporary that has own voices for the Muslim representation, and this book is also known as When Michael Met Mina, depending on where you're buying the book. And this is dual perspective between our two main characters of Michael and Mina. Mina is a refugee from Afghanistan who is now living in Australia after seeking asylum there. And Michael is a boy who is white, and his parents are actually in charge of an anti-immigration group. And these two characters cross paths, and of course initially they don't have a lot in common, but as the book goes on they start to spend more time together, and Michael starts to question the things that his parents have taught him and that he's always heard growing up. and he starts to wonder what he actually believes and starts to think that the things that he has always just grown up accepting are actually wrong. And I really liked this overall. I really enjoyed some of the characters. Mina was such a fantastic character to follow. She's so strong and resilient, and I think the way that her trauma and her grief were handled was very thoughtful and very intentional, because you don't get all of this backstory about her dumped on you from the first chapter that she narrates, which I think makes sense because that's not how people think about their own experiences. You get it in little pieces throughout the book, and you end up getting a full picture of the kinds of things that she has gone through and that her family has gone through and the loss that she has experienced, without it ever feeling like, now I'm going to introduce a main character and tell you all about their tragic backstory. And I also really like the way that it was consistently a part of Mina's life without overtaking her character or reducing her to just her circumstances. And I think that also is true to real life. People who have experienced grief or hardship, you're not thinking about it with 100% of your brain all the time, but it is something that's always with you. But at the same time, you know, there would be chunks of the book where Mina would be doing something fun. She'd be out with friends and she'd be enjoying herself, and she would not be actively thinking about the hard things that she's gone through. And sometimes that brought up feelings of guilt, which again felt very natural. I just feel like all of that was handled in a really thoughtful and what seemed like a true to life way. I also want to make it clear that I really liked Mina as a character, separate from her experiences of grief and trauma and everything. She was just really fun and smart, and she had such a fierce desire to do what was right. And she loved her family so much, and she always wanted to do the right thing, and I just really, really admired her as a character. And she was also really entertaining and fun. I also really liked some of the side characters, like her friend Paula. I just loved, and not just because she's an Oscar Wilde fan. She was just so clever and so entertaining, and I really love the way that her and Mina stuck up for each other and were always there for each other. Some of the other characters, though, I was not the biggest fan of, like Michael, and you're not supposed to like him at the beginning, but it took me a long time to warm up to him and to see kind of the potential in him. Like, for quite a big chunk of this book, I wasn't really, like, his arc felt kind of strange to me, because it kind of seemed like he went from this really racist guy to somebody who's very open-minded and starting to question everything, and then suddenly, like, he is a good person. But then I realized, like, I think that was the point, because I think the reason Michael's character was written that way is to show that sometimes people who believe and say these horrible racist things, sometimes it's because they've just never made that decision for themselves about what to believe, which is not to excuse what he says or does. But I think that's the reason why his arc felt kind of inconsistent to me, is because it was supposed to be that way. Like, he had a big shift when he started thinking for himself rather than just parroting what he had heard his whole life. I also want to mention a really small thing that bothered me about this book, and I didn't take points off or anything for this because it was very minor, but it did bug me, and that is that something I liked about this book is grief is discussed in a way where it's not something you can measure against other people's. Like, Mina has obviously gone through something really difficult, and she's talking to a friend of hers who's really worried about one of her pets, and her friend says to her, like, I'm sorry, I know this is nothing like what you've gone through. And Mina says, like, you're hurting, you know, that's the important thing. Like, of course I'm not going to say you don't get to be upset because I went through something worse. And I thought that was really beautiful and really lovely, and I just really like when the grief of being worried about animals or losing animals that you love is handled like that, is handled very thoughtfully. So that was great. And then almost immediately after that scene, we get a reference to the fact that, like, well, if somebody cared about their cat that much, that would be weird, because, like, the animal that this friend was talking about was a dog. And as an equal opportunity animal lover, that bothered me. So again, I didn't take points off for that, but it did really bug me. And then the writing is another thing that it kind of took me a while to get used to. It's hard for me to explain, but there was something about the way this was written that didn't quite click right. And I don't mean the specifically Australian references or anything. I mean, it was like something about the way the writing was structured, or maybe that the dialogue was incorporated, felt a little bit choppy to me. But I think I got used to that as the book went on, and I actually think this was a really, really quick read. This is a somewhat long contemporary. This edition is about 400 pages, and I flew through this, which I think is partly the writing and also just it's a very engaging story. So I gave The Lines We Cross 4 stars. Next, I finished Why You Should Read Children's Books Even Though You Are So Old and Wise by Catherine Rendell. And this is a very, very short, like, this is so tiny, and I think it's like 60 pages, nonfiction book about children's literature and why it is incredibly important. And shout out to my lovely friend Hannah from Lynn Hermione for giving this to me for my birthday. This was such a lovely surprise, and I absolutely fell in love with this book, which, considering the title, is probably not a surprise to anybody. It's so short that I really don't want to give away too much, but I think this was the perfect balance of humorous and brilliant and profound and beautiful. Catherine Rendell basically said a lot of things that I've been trying to say about children's fiction for a while now, but in a much more eloquent and wonderful way. And this is a book that I think anybody who is passionate about storytelling or about books, I think this is a book for you. I think if you have a special appreciation or love for children's literature, you are going to have a more personal reaction to this book. But even if you don't, I think this is just such a powerful meditation on the beauty of storytelling and the absolute necessity of imagination. And hopefully if you're somebody who picks this up who is not so much into children's literature, or who maybe doesn't see the point of children's literature or of adults reading children's literature, hopefully this book would maybe start to open your mind a little bit to the wonderful treasures that are waiting for you in children's books. So I gave this book 5 stars. This ended up being my favorite book of the month, actually, and I absolutely loved this. Just cannot recommend highly enough. Next, I finished Castle in the Air by Diana Wynne Jones. This is the second book in the Howl's Moving Castle trilogy, but it's more of a companion sequel. We do see a few characters from the first book, but primarily this follows a different set of characters and a different story and setting. Our main character is a man named Abdullah, and he lives in kind of a Thousand and One Nights inspired setting or world, or kingdom, I guess, because it's still in the world of Howl's Moving Castle. And he ends up falling in love with this princess named Flower in the Night, and he doesn't really know her very well. And just as he's starting to get to know her, she gets kidnapped by a djinn, and so that sets Abdullah off on this adventure to try and rescue her so that he can marry her, because they're both in love with each other. And of course, along the way, there's a lot of obstacles. He picks up some companions very grudgingly, and the rest of the book is about him trying to find and rescue Flower in the Night, and kind of getting sidetracked with some other side plots and side adventures and other characters and what they're going after that all kind of end up tied together at the end. And I had heard that this book is the least enjoyable of the 3, and I'm glad I was prepared, because I didn't like this very much, and I love Howl's Moving Castle. And I didn't mind that the tone and the setting of this one was so different, because I tend to actually quite enjoy companion series, but Abdullah as a main character, I just kind of didn't like him. He's super judgmental, for one thing. Like, he's extremely fatphobic, and he's just a pretty selfish person in a lot of ways. He's not terribly nice. He's not very understanding. Like, he's not somebody that you're really excited about rooting for. Like, I wanted him to find Flower in the Night, but that was mainly because I knew that was the main plot of this book and I wanted that resolved. I will say that I did like the very beginning and the very end of this book. The beginning is set in that kind of Thousand and One Nights inspired world, and I enjoyed that different setting. I enjoyed some of the magic elements in this book, and I also really liked the ending. Especially there's a scene with a bunch of princesses that I think was the best scene in the book, and that's also where we get to know Flower in the Night a lot better, because until then she's been kind of a flat character, but she gets just like a couple of scenes at the end of this book, and I'm like, you're already a more compelling character than Abdullah was, and we followed him for a whole novel. So I ended up really liking the end and how some of the plot threads kind of came together in the end. Diana Wynne Jones is really excellent at those endings, but the middle of the book was just plain boring, and again filled with a lot of characters I didn't care about. There was this really long section in the middle that was basically Abdullah traveling with another character I didn't like, so that wasn't super enjoyable. They did end up picking up some cats along the way, so that was fun. But yeah, that part of the book was a real slog for me to get through. And also, to top it all off, there were some things, like some of the resolution at the ending rubbed me the wrong way, because it involved giving away women in marriages without asking them. And it was kind of supposed to be comical, and I think we were supposed to feel like, because they were initially upset about it, but then they had like one interaction with the person they were being like shoved off on, that was positive, we were supposed to be like, oh, so they're gonna be happy after all. And I don't know, I don't think that was enough. Like, I know it's kind of nitpicking because this is older fantasy and it was supposed to be in like a kind of comedic way, but it did bother me. So I think on top of everything else that I wasn't enjoying about this book, that was kind of an extra thing that I didn't like. I just felt really bad for all the women that it happened to. So everything all together, I gave Castle in the Air 2.75 stars. Next, I finished Queen of the Sea by Dylan McConis. This is an alternate historical fiction graphic novel. This is kind of a loose interpretation of the story of the exile of Queen Elizabeth I by her sister Queen Mary. I had to look down to check specifically which queens this was based on. And this is a pretty long graphic novel. It's about 400 pages, and I think that's one of the reasons I ended up enjoying this so much. I'm still pretty new to graphic novels. I just realized I didn't tell you the plot of this. Our main character is a girl named Margaret, and she has grown up on this island with this group of nuns, and she's an orphan, so she doesn't really know anything about her birth family, but she's pretty happy on this island. And then one day the queen gets overthrown by her sister, and I think in this book the queen's name is Eleanor. It's kind of confusing because it's different from the queen that this book is actually based on. So Queen Eleanor gets exiled to this island, and then Margaret slowly starts to get to know Eleanor, and to learn more about what's happening in the wider world, to learn more about what the purpose of this convent is, why she was left here. And there's a lot of plot about like the wider political things going on at the time, but this is also a very personal story, which I really liked. I liked the way those things were balanced, and like I was saying before, I really enjoyed this graphic novel, and I think part of that is because it was so long compared to other ones that I have read. Again, I'm very new to these, but one of the things that I felt kind of suffered before with some graphic novels I've read is the characters. I just don't feel like the short amount of page time is enough to get me attached to characters, especially when you're primarily getting to know them through pictures. And in this graphic novel, actually, there was quite a bit of text, so maybe that was another reason why I felt like I got connected to these characters more. But I can confidently say that out of the graphic novels I have read so far, this is the one with the best developed characters, at least for me. Eleanor especially is such a fascinating character because you really hate her sometimes, but you understand why she's the way she is, and you see that there's enough good in her from the beginning that you still care about what happens to her. Like, you still care enough to follow her. And Margaret as a main character I also really liked. I loved the supporting cast of all of these nuns on the island. I love the way that they all took care of Margaret, and I love the way that Margaret had a slightly different relationship with all of them because, you know, that's what happens with real people. I also really loved the art style and the plot and the setting of this novel. I'll also try to insert a clip that shows some of the art in this book because I really, really enjoyed that. And the really fun way that some of the dialogue and the text was incorporated into the graphic novel and balanced with the illustrations. And really, there's only two things that I think could have been done better with this graphic novel. One of them is the ending. There's some things I liked about it and some things I wasn't quite satisfied with. And then the other thing is this whole alternate history concept. I still don't really understand why this had to be alternate history rather than just a straight up historical fiction. I'm not really sure how Dylan McConis made the decision to, for one thing, make this an alternate history, and for another, to decide which elements she was going to change and which she was going to keep true to history. Like, for example, this graphic novel is set on this island with a convent of nuns, and they use the word nuns, so you kind of assume that this is Catholic, but then you start getting some backstory about the religion of these people on this island, and it seems to be different. Like, there are some parallels to Catholicism, but it seems like, okay, this is a different belief system. But then some people wear crosses and they describe the services as mass, and so it was kind of confusing because it seemed like if you're going to change that part, why wouldn't you change the other parts? So I don't know, I felt like that was kind of weird, but overall I really, really enjoyed this and I would definitely recommend it. And I gave Queen of the Sea 4 stars. Next, I finished our Austen Anonymous book for April, and that was Mansfield Park by Jane Austen. I think at this point, by the time this video goes up, our live show will have already happened, so I will link that down below. Thank you to our wonderful guests, Julia from Shakespeare and Such and Hannah from Lynn Hermione, and of course thank you to my co-host Taylor. So this book, I said in my Goodreads review that Mansfield Park is the measure for measure of Jane Austen for me, which is such a Shakespeare thing to say, but basically what I mean by that is it's not my favorite of Jane Austen's novels, but I will talk about this book forever. Like, I have so many thoughts about it. You can tell from all of these tabs. This one we follow our main character Fanny Price, and she is sent to live with her wealthy aunt and uncle and cousins when she's very, very young. This was very common in Jane Austen's time for poorer families to try and get their kids kind of unofficially adopted for a while to raise them and to take some of the financial difficulty off them. So that's what happens to Fanny right at the beginning of the book. And then we skip forward in time, and most of the book takes place when I think she's about 17 or 18. And at this point, she's formed a really close bond with Edmund, one of her cousins. She also has a huge crush on him because, remember, this is a classic, cousin marriage was fine. So she also is really, really in love with him, but she hasn't told anybody. And then the balance of their life is upset when a brother and sister, Henry and Mary Crawford, move into the area. And so Mary and Henry end up becoming very involved with the Mansfield Park family. And the rest of the book is about the messy relationships that ensue from that. And of course, because it's a Jane Austen book, there's so many more layers going on besides that, but that's kind of the general overview. And yeah, like I said, so many things to say about this book. This is also one that I appreciate more every single time I read, which I think is true of all of Jane Austen's books, but there are several specific things that I like actively enjoyed more this time around. Like Fanny is a main character. She is very, very different from I think basically all of Jane Austen's other heroines, or at least a lot of the ones that are most popular, because she's not outspoken, she's not sassy, and I remembered her being very kind of like lacking in personality last time I read this, but this time around I enjoyed her so much more, and I realized that she's not lacking in personality. She's just been raised in a way that's like, you don't deserve to express yourself. Like, poor Fanny has always been impressed with how lucky she is to be there, how much she owes her aunt and uncle for deigning to take her in and take care of her. So she's grown up having kind of her own personality and her own voice kind of suppressed a lot. So the fact that she still is able to have this really good heart and this really clever mind and these interests that we see throughout the book is pretty amazing. And then also Henry and Mary Crawford are such fascinating characters. Mary, I remembered not liking as much, but after reading this book this time around, I'm like, a lot of the things that characters think she's bad for are like not that bad by our standards. And Henry has such an interesting character arc that kind of hurts my heart, but it's so well done. Of course, there's always a lot of commentary on classism, but this book is interesting in that there's also some commentary about slavery, in the implications that the Bertram family made their money through the slave trade and how Fanny kind of calls them out on that a little bit. And it's definitely not a huge part of the novel. It's not like directly addressed a lot. But the fact that this was a genteel novel of the time and it was still dealing with those things, I think is very interesting. So definitely one of Austen's most underappreciated novels, if not the most underappreciated, but I think it's really, really solid, and I gave Mansfield Park 4 stars. And finally, the last book I finished in April was A Curse So Dark and Lonely by Bridget Kemmerer. This is a Beauty and the Beast retelling that was all over BookTube, actually has been all over BookTube for the last couple of years, and it's dual perspective. And we actually start out this book in our world, but most of it takes place in a fantasy world, and Harper is a regular girl from our world, and one day she sees a man, what looks like a man kidnapping another girl. So she runs up to him to stop him, and she gets taken instead to this magical land of Emberfall, and eventually she finds out that she and other girls have been taken over and over once a season in order to try and break this curse that has been placed on Prince Ren, who is our other perspective character, and he is the Prince of Emberfall. So the rest of the book is about Ren trying to break this curse, trying to get Harper to help him break the curse, but of course Harper was taken against her will. She has family members that really need her back home. Eventually she does start to care enough about the people in this world that she might want to help break this curse, but she's struggling to reconcile that with her need and her wish to return home. So this has been a very hyped book. And although there were some aspects that I was a little disappointed in, overall I really did enjoy this. Harper is a main character. I really admired her. She's really strong and resilient. She also has cerebral palsy, which I've heard from Own Voices reviewers that representation is done very well. And so it was really interesting to see her have to struggle against people who maybe made assumptions about her, about what she was capable of. And I just think it was very thoughtfully incorporated in this book because it was a part of Harper's life and it did affect her. Like it wasn't something that was just brushed over for the sake of the plot or anything, but it also wasn't her full character. Like there was more to Harper than her diagnosis, and I think that came through really well in the book. I also ended up really enjoying Ren's character arc, or partly character arc and partly us getting to know him better, because we kind of start out like Harper thinking he's this like basic spoiled prince, and as we start to learn more about him and as we start to see him interact more with other characters, we realize that that's not true, that Harper and maybe us as the reader judged him too quickly, and I always really enjoy that when you as the reader, your experience of this other person mirrors the main characters. I also loved a lot of the side characters, especially Gray, Noah, Freya, and Zoe. I really enjoyed. I know that the second book follows Gray, so I'm very excited about that. I will say I wasn't quite on board for the romance the whole time. Once Harper and Ren actually like make a plan of attack, and they start working together on trying to save his kingdom and all of that, like once they had a concrete goal that they were working towards and spending time with each other about, that's when I started enjoying their relationship more, and I started being like more into the idea of them in a romance together. But even with that said, I kind of wanted to be more excited about the romance than I was. And then also Harper. So I did like her, like I was saying earlier, but kind of the opposite with Ren's character. I found myself getting more frustrated with Harper as the book went on. Like I wasn't really able to understand her decision process sometimes. Like there were quite a few scenes, especially near the middle of the book, where she kind of felt like one of those generic like strong female characters. She just like runs off into danger, doesn't ask anyone for help, doesn't understand that her actions are going to have consequences. And again, some of that does kind of make sense with her character, like with her personality and everything, but there were places where she did that where it felt like we had already moved past that, like we were backtracking in her character arc. Like it felt like we had already moved past this and then she did it again. So that was kind of frustrating, but I did end up liking her more near the very end of the book, and just the end of the book in general I think was really, really well done. I'm trying not to give spoilers, but the part where something very drastic changes, and Harper and some of the other characters have to try and work out a way to deal with it, and especially with how that relates to the other kingdoms that are kind of trying to take over Emberfall. That was very convoluted, but if you've read it, I think you know the part I'm talking about. And then finally, I also got really, really tired of hearing how special Harper was compared to all of the other girls that Gray and Ren had tried to get to break the curse. Like we already know that Harper is the main character of this book and that we're going to be focusing on her. You don't need to pull down all of these other nameless women just to make her seem more interesting or more capable by comparison. And it was like in Harper's narration, it was in like generally the way the book was written, other characters would say this to her or about her, that like Harper was so different from the other girls and she wasn't like other girls, and even to things that were a little bit ridiculous because we know that Gray and Ren have had hundreds of seasons of this curse. So they've taken at least a couple hundred girls at this point trying to break this curse. And apparently Harper is the only one in the entire history of doing this who has ever put on pants instead of a pretty frilly dress from the wardrobe. And I just find that very hard to believe. Like there's this whole moment of Harper thinking to herself, like, I know most girls would go right for that wardrobe full of pretty frilly dresses, but I'm going to go for the riding pants. And it's like, it just felt unnecessary. That kind of thing happened quite a bit in this book. I think once we got into the other plot stuff, it started happening less just because we weren't as focused on like all of the other girls that had been kidnapped. But yeah, that did really great on me. Overall though, I did enjoy this. I ended up giving A Curse So Dark and Lonely 3.5 stars. Although like I said, I'm really excited for the sequel and I feel like I'm going to enjoy that one even more. Okay everybody, so those are all of the books that I read in April. Please let me know if you have read any of these books, what you thought of them, or if you're going to pick any of them up. By the way, I did complete all of my OWL's prompts for the month, so that was great. I ended up shuffling some things around, so I didn't read all of the books on my TBR, but I did complete all of the prompts. So that makes me happy. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you soon with another video, and I hope you love the next book you read. Bye!